In my humble opinion, it's very reductive to say that the original Star Wars trilogy is purely a Dune ripoff. But a lot of the connections between the two were clearly identifiable when the film was released in 1977. The surface stuff like desert planets, space travel, spice, and certain character archetypes. Many of the deeper themes are similar too. Explorations of religious fundamentalism, war, and the monomyth. Then there's the voice in Dune and the Jedi mind trick in Star Wars, a galaxy that feels both futuristic and feudal. But Star Wars also brought a lot of its own stuff to the table, even if it too was drawn from a variety of sources. It was a unique and powerful fusion of images, ideas, tropes, and textures. World War II dogfighting homages, Flash Gordon serials, Kurosawa samurai movie imagery, magnificent iconic hairdos resembling European pastry products, Cloud City, a talking goldfish man in a turtleneck collar, alien jazz bands, and a Shaolin Muppet. Star Wars was, as George himself put it, John Wayne movies and Errol Flynn movies and all that stuff. I saw that kids today don't have any fantasy life the way we had. They don't have westerns, they don't have pirate movies, they don't have that stupid serial fantasy life that we used to believe in. The myths which existed in high adventure and an exotic far-off land which was always that place over the hill, Camelot, Robin Hood, Treasure Island, big adventure out there somewhere. It came all the way down through the westerns. Then there's the fact that the hero's journey in the original Star Wars trilogy ultimately ends in triumph and redemption, whereas Dune is anything but a straightforward exemplum or endorsement of Joseph Campbell's touted monomyth or hero's journey. That's quite a fundamental difference between the two in my book, and along with all these other elements, it's more than enough to distinguish Star Wars and Dune, despite the numerous borrowings. These parallels aren't news to anyone, of course, but as I watched Dune 2 at the IMAX, the similarities with the Star Wars prequels screamed out to me like a burning Jawa. I then went back and read the original Dune book recently, and yeah, it's the Star Wars prequels that are really undeniably derivative of Dune. In fact, some might say that Dune and Dune 2 are the Star Wars prequels done right.
It's treason, then.
Now, of course, nothing exists in a vacuum, does it? Dune itself borrows directly from The Sabres of Paradise by Leslie Blanche, a novel about the Great Caucasus War of 1834 to 1859, where the warring mountain tribes of Dagestan and Chechnya united under the charismatic leadership of the Muslim chieftain Imam Shamil, the Lion of Dagestan. For 25 years, this disparate band of guerrillas held at bay the mighty armies of invading Russia, strengthened only by the desire for an independent Caucasus and their religious faith. Terms such as Padishah, Shaitan, Naib, Chakobsa, or Kanli, among others, would also be used in Dune a few years later, with the exact same meaning and in the same context. A high percentage of these direct quotations from the Sabres of Paradise were used by Frank Herbert as citations from works written by the Princess Irulan. And while we're on the topic, what's the value of originality in and of itself? Well, hardly anything, really, I would say. I mean, I could staple a squirrel to a throw pillow stuffed with Haribo Tang Fast Sticks, drizzle it with truffle oil and strawberry sauce, tie it to a great big stick from the garden, and that would certainly be original too, but it wouldn't really be much use to anyone, would it? Herbert appears to have reimagined the warring tribes of the Sabres of Paradise in a futuristic setting, and they end up being very different novels to actually read, ultimately. But it's true that a lot of the stuff is borrowed, it seems, and like the OT, given all the other stuff it brings to the table and given the entertainment it provides, just because a lot of it's borrowed doesn't mean it's of no value. Certainly not. I think one of Lucas's many talents was in weaving together many disparate sources into something relatively coherent, very entertaining and engaging. Herbert too weaved stuff like Spengler's Decline of the West, Catholic and Islamic thought, the European feudal system, etc. into his Dune books. The individual elements weren't new, inverted commas, but they were arranged in a way that certainly was. And more importantly, they were engaging, entertaining, and maybe even enlightening. Both the OT and Dune take existing sources and make something new with them, something with their own inherent value. Can we say the same of the prequels? I don't really think so, unfortunately. It's derivative, and it also doesn't really work as entertainment. Certainly not to anything like the same degree anyway, in my opinion. With all that said, let's look at some of the similarities. Both movies, or sets of movies, tell a dark subversion of the Chosen One narrative, but Paul Atreides' arc is a heck of a lot stronger than Anakin Skywalker's. Paul Atreides has often been compared to Luke Skywalker over the decades, but in fact he's far more similar to Anakin. The two are the figures of great prophecy seen by the powerful factions who seek to control them as a potential savior. Each forms bonds and relationships that will force them to challenge their worldview, endure visions of terrible things to come, and while they ultimately begin down a heroic path with noble intentions, to varying degrees, they become corrupted in one way or another. I mean, hell, there's even a scene with a count and an emperor who says, "Do it."
Or a kitchen with style, B&Q it. Giving a room a smile, B&Q it. You can do it when you B&Q it.
The difference between the prequels and Dune is that in Dune you have a strong script and convincing actors in the role. You also have a romance that kind of works, action scenes that actually feel like they're taking place in a physical, tangible world involving physical, tangible people and objects. One-on-one duels with a real sense of physicality, heft and jeopardy to them. Mesmerizing scenes like the Colosseum fight in Dune 2 that absolutely transport you smack bang to the center of some bizarre alien world. It's just vastly better. Anakin's character arc, despite having more movies devoted to it, ends up feeling rushed, less developed, and on the whole much less satisfying than that of Paul Atreides. One of the major issues with Anakin for me is that he's so fundamentally unlikable. He's cocky, creepy, lightweight, light years away from his portrayal in the original trilogy, and yes, despite his extremely difficult upbringing, he does come across as an ungrateful little twat most of the time. The way Anakin's portrayed, consciously or not, is as a teenage jerk. He's a creep, especially around Padme. Hayden Christensen essays a little smirk, which I guess is meant to be likeable but ends up being completely off-putting. His mooning after Padme turns into rather aggressive pursuit, and he spends much of the time sulking, all of which make Anakin a teenage cardboard cutout with no humour, no depth, no self-reflection. He says he has bad dreams, but he doesn't really seem tortured by them. That does indeed seem to have been by design, of course. George himself has said that Hayden Christensen had told him, and I quote, "I don't want to be this whiny kid." To which George replied, "Well, you are. You've got to be a whiny teenager. You've got to be a petulant young Jedi. You're not going to be the guy you thought you'd be when you signed the contract." I get all that stuff, and I get the circumstances that shaped Anakin, and I get that the Order let him down and that he lost his mum, and I get the failure of patriarchal authority angle, and all of this stuff. But the bottom line is that if you're trying to create a tragedy, then the character has to evoke some form of sympathy in the viewer, right? I just didn't really care when Anakin turned to the dark side. There were no stakes, and nothing really to be learned, because he was so charmless and irritating in the first place. Kylo Ren is a more effective teenage emo, because of the acting skills of Adam Driver, and one can only assume, better direction of actors by Abrams and Johnson. While I don't think Christensen is much cop as Anakin, he's working with a lousy script and a director who has little to no interest in actors by all accounts. What about Dune? Well, you're meant to see Paul Atreides as a complicated but sympathetic figure at the beginning of his Shakespearean hero's journey. Then Dune Part 2 lays bare what it takes for a person to become a mythic figure and challenges you to understand just how profoundly bleak this tale has always been. Paul is much more composed and confident, and he's had a vastly better upbringing than Anakin, of course, but, well, sympathy is the key word, really. Anakin is a freed slave who's been abruptly wrenched from his mother, has no father or siblings, and whose substitute father figure Qui-Gon is killed at the end of the first film. Anakin has suffered all manner of trauma, which the Jedi simply do not understand. It appears that he talks to Obi-Wan about his bad dreams, but all his master can do is offer homilies about clearing his mind. Anakin needs therapy, and all the Jedi can offer is discipline. Despite all of this stuff, it's kind of mystifying how still he manages to remain non-sympathetic. One of the greatest causes of this, in my opinion, is the risible romance, which is far from fit for purpose. Well, to be fair, there is a point in Attack of the Clones where Anakin confesses to killing all the Sand people, men, women, and children. By far the best bit of the movie, actually, where Anakin and Padme's relationship actually kind of works, despite all the talk of sand and the frolicking about on the giant CGI tick cows earlier on in the film. Padme's care and concern for Anakin is well motivated at this point in the film. In a sense, she acts like his mother, the one he has just lost, in comforting him. I think the romance between them would have been massively more effective if it had begun with nurturing and healing. Anakin is clearly wounded, which gains its physical symbol at the end when Count Dooku cuts off his right hand in a lightsaber duel, and a growing emotional closeness between them would have seemed much better motivated. As it is, Padmé's profession of love for him before the arena fight just appears mechanical. As mechanical as the right hand with which Anakin takes Padmé's on their wedding day. That did give me a good chuckle though, in fairness. The romance is perhaps the weakest aspect of the prequels, but Dune 2's romance is one of its strongest hands. We see Chani in Paul's dreams, then we see them meet, exchange glances, we see her initial doubt and reluctance, we then see them in battle together against the Harkonnen, we see her teaching him how to walk in the sand without attracting the deadly sandworms. All this stuff flows quite naturally, and it mostly convinces. Zendaya and Timothée Chalamet work well together. Once that relationship is established, it gives Paul Atreides, and therefore the audience, something to fight for and to fear losing. The shots of Chani in battle, acting out a vision Paul had of himself, and a vision of her scarred and burned from his use of atomic weapons, are among the most stirring in the movie. I never really felt a sense of jeopardy or concern about Anakin and Padmé's relationship falling apart, and I wasn't really moved at all when Padmé kinda died for some reason, because neither of these characters nor their relationship convinced me in the first place. The stuff with Anakin's mother, on the other hand, does work pretty well, in my opinion. Her death in Episode 2 is by far the strongest part of that movie, and possibly of the whole trilogy, and it's kind of a shame that their relationship doesn't get more screen time. The prequels spend absolutely ages explaining the ultimately pretty inconsequential broader geopolitical stuff on various mostly inconsequential hijinks and locations, and yet they fail to do an adequate job with their central characters and their relationships. There might be room for that kind of largely peripheral background info in a novel, but in a series of 3 theatrical movies, well, certain things have to be prioritised, I think. And wisely, movie Dune only hints at most of that stuff and devotes most of its runtime to its central characters and its themes because, well, that's the core of the movie, isn't it, really? It also takes its time to show and tell, whereas the prequel movies pretty much just tell us everything that the characters are feeling, and they do so in extremely stilted, awkward dialogue. On the topic of dialogue, Lucas once said in an interview that I'd be the first person to say I can't write dialogue. My dialogue is very utilitarian and is designed to move things forward. I'm not Shakespeare, it's not designed to be poetic. It's not designed to have a clever turn of phrase. There was no place for that kind of thing in this particular movie. I'm aware that dialogue isn't my strength. I use it as a device. I don't particularly like dialogue, which is part of the problem. That being the case, why is there so much dialogue in the prequels? There's absolutely reams of it. Lucas is amazing, genius even, at the sort of purely visual storytelling on display almost constantly in the original trilogy, so why then does everyone in the prequels sit around telling each other how they feel the whole time, rather than showing us? In contrast, Paul Atreides' core relationships, the ones that factor into the decisions he makes, Chani, Stilgar, Lady Jessica, each have room to flourish and are given due care and attention. These are not terribly likeable, fuzzy, warm, even lovable characters like we have in the OT. This is one of the key differentiators of the OT and Dune for me, but nevertheless their relationships are consistent, well motivated, convincing, and yes, sympathetic, despite their frostiness. The Chosen One prophecy in Star Wars is rather vague. It's never fully explained in exact terms on screen, and by design or not, there's no real sense of Anakin himself reckoning with destiny in the same way Paul Atreides does. It doesn't really tally with what we know about this world from the original 3 movies, and feels like many elements of the prequels crowbarred into an existing IP and a framework that doesn't really support them, even if many of the central pillars of it existed before the original films were made. As George himself said in an interview that when writing the prequels he kept bumping up against the reality of the original films, and it shows. Revenge of the Sith is a lot stronger than the other 2, yeah, but unfortunately its least convincing scene is one of the most important. This is largely due to it being done so damn quickly. I'm talking of course about the scene where Anakin, right after preventing Mace Windu from killing Palpatine, accepts the Emperor as his master. A Apparently, Lucas himself turned to the idea that Anakin succumbs to the dark side because of wanting to prevent the loss of Padme, rather than through a loss of faith in the ethics and politics of the Order, rather late in the day. In 10 minutes of screen time, he goes from staring moodily out of the window of the Jedi Temple, torn between being a Jedi Knight and his love for his wife, to murdering children. He must surely know that when Padme finds out about his betrayal and murder of the Jedi and the Republic, that she would reject him. What makes his turn to the dark side so problematic is that Anakin is characterized throughout as being rebellious, refusing authority. Had he just not found the right master to submit to? He seems to have accepted Palpatine as master sadomasochistically. He embraces his pain and suffering as a kind of jouissance. It just doesn't really follow. And this is unfortunate because there absolutely is a point to these Star Wars prequels. There's a strong subtext there, it just wasn't communicated to the audience in an effective manner. All the stuff Anakin says later to Padme and Obi-Wan about power and taking over from the Emperor is pure bunkum. It's not power Anakin wants, it is submission to authority, an authority that Obi-Wan never had as his brother, inverted commas. The psychosexual pain/release of the... when Vader is told of Padme's death is the completion of his trajectory towards self-abasing servitude. Darth Vader is a costume, a sadism suit. It hides the soft, damaged, masochistic Anakin. It's only when, in Return of the Jedi, that he accepts his own authority as Luke's father is he able to overthrow the Emperor, quite literally, and thence to die. What we have in the prequel trilogy is a failure of patriarchal authority. It's Anakin's lack of a father, the death of the substitute Qui-Gon, and then Obi-Wan's failure to be a parental figure that leads directly to Anakin's doom. At the end of the film, as Darth Vader/Anakin, in hearing from Palpatine that he had killed Padme, another lie, of course, must know that he has also killed the twins his wife was carrying. To drive home the point, Lucas intercuts the birth, inverted commas, of Vader with the actual birth of Luke and Leia. There's a lot here. There absolutely is. Something strong, powerful, maybe even profound, but the delivery of it all is so fucking ham-fisted it's like serving Dom Perignon from a filthy old traffic cone with the hole at the top melted shut. If there's any Star Wars trilogy crying out for a remake, it is in fact this one, because it could have been really great. So what's Dune all about then? Frank Herbert said many times that Dune's central theme is the dangers of the superhero. In a piece of that name, republished in Tim O'Reilly's The Maker of Dune, Herbert claims that the original spark of the novel was his conviction that superheroes are disastrous for mankind, and a desire to dramatise how the myth-making impulse that crowns a hero inevitably conjures a toxic, totalitarian social system of demagogues, fanatics, con-game artists, and innocent and not-so-innocent bystanders. Dune then explores what makes the hero seductive enough that people willingly, even rapturously, turn over their judgment and decision-making faculties. This framing locates Dune alongside projects like Adorno's F-Scale in the grand tradition of post-war theorizing about fascist subjectivity. Rather than theorize the seductiveness of the fascist imagination, Herbert's novel is intended to function as a trap, a mechanism intended both to perform the siren song of hero worship and simultaneously estrange them from that experience, exposing their own complicit desires for it. At various points in the book, Paul is troubled by prescient visions of a great and terrible intergalactic jihad. Blood and fire and all that good stuff. He is absolutely determined to avoid this, but in the end, that's exactly what he brings about. And what's more, unlike Star Wars, his arc towards that end makes sense. There's a bit of Paul's own agency at work in this outcome, and there's a mountain of circumstance and raw emotion. There's a kind of grim inevitability to these galactic events that just lands right. Again, it's powerful stuff, and I think the film grasps and crucially is able to communicate the profound and sustained ambivalence of this great novel very well indeed. In J.W. Rinzler's The Making of Star Wars Return of the Jedi, there's a great quote about George Lucas's early conception of politics in Star Wars. In the July 13th, 1981 story conference with Richard Marquand, Lawrence Kasdan and Howard Kazanjian, is it? Don't know how to pronounce that, sorry. Lucas explained about Emperor Palpatine. He was a politician. Richard M. Nixon was his name. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and became an imperial guy, and he was really evil. But he pretended to be a really nice guy. He sucked Luke's father into the dark side. It's well known that Lucas based parts of the original trilogy on political events in the 1970s, with the concept of primitive natives defeating a technologically superior army taken directly from the Vietnam War. Nevertheless, it's still surprising how directly Lucas equated Palpatine with Nixon. Ultimately, despite this quote, Palpatine is much more than a simple Richard Nixon clone. I think Palpatine also contains elements of Hitler and Augustus Caesar in his scheming to overthrow an elected government. Palpatine's name also evokes ancient Rome, particularly the Palatine Hills. Moreover, Palpatine in his Sith incarnation has elements of Satan, especially in Revenge of the Sith, where he plays the role of tempter to Anakin Skywalker. Lucas's equation of Palpatine with Nixon was partly a sign of the times, and his formative experiences as a young man during the 60s and 70s. Nevertheless, it provides a fascinating insight into Lucas's original conception of politics in Star Wars, especially as it suggests that he initially saw the Republic as similar to American democracy. Much later, 2005 to be exact-ish, George Lucas said that although he wrote the original film during the Vietnam War, his 6-part saga could apply to the war in Iraq. And I quote, "In terms of evil, one of the original concepts was how does a democracy turn itself into a dictatorship? The parallels between what we did in Vietnam and what we're doing in Iraq now are unbelievable. On the personal level, it was how does a good person turn into a bad person? And part of the observation of that is that most bad people think they are good people. They are doing it for the right reasons." In a Chicago Tribune piece, Lucas and his producer Rick McCollum commented on the real-life parallels and confirmed that they were unintentional. McCollum said, "First of all, we never thought of Bush ever becoming president, or then 9/11, the Patriot Act, war, weapons of mass destruction. Then suddenly you realize, oh my god, there's something happening that looks like we're almost prescient. And then we thought, well yeah, but he'll never make it to the second term, so we'll look like we just made up some wacky political parody of a guy that everybody's forgotten." Obviously that prediction didn't come to pass. Revenge of the Sith wound up premiering during the first year of Bush's second term as president. So, is this prescience? Well, perhaps it's a case of history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. What about Dune's prescience? Philosopher John Gray published an article about Dune 2 in the New Statesman recently, identifying its relevance to the geopolitics of today. I'm just going to read most of this out to you because I certainly couldn't say it better myself. The warring empires and dynasties of Denis Villeneuve's visual extravaganza have been derided for their archaism, yet the film presents a world not unlike the one coming into being around us. It's an axiom of progressive thinking that there can be no irreversible return to the past. Liberal democracy may have run its course, but it will be succeeded by a regime of a kind never before known. An authentic type of socialism, a cosmopolitan egalitarian community, or perhaps a technocracy governed by impartial experts. In fact, failing liberal societies are morphing into high-tech versions of feudalism. Dune Part 2 is not a phantasm of the future, but an epiphany of the present. In Dune, power is based on control of a rare natural resource. Extracted from the fungal excretions of sandworm larvae, the psychotropic drug spice enhances the lifespan and mental abilities of its users, giving some of them a prescience that facilitates interstellar travel. Social status is decided by the caste in which you were born, and any moves you can make serving the hereditary ruling elites. Our way of life is similar. Far from being immaterial, the virtual economy exacerbates scarcity in the material resources it consumes while damaging the planetary environment. Much of the electricity required to produce cryptocurrencies comes from fossil fuels, a large portion from coal. The carbon footprint of the cloud has been estimated as being bigger than the airline industries. Data servers need cooling by irrigation, increasing water shortages. I sounded a bit pissed there, didn't I? The minerals used in batteries require mining on a gigantic scale. Natural resources are the foundation on which our digital economy stands. The film is very faithful to the novel in most aspects. So was Frank Herbert prescient in this regard, or did he just dig the feudal sci-fi vibe on a purely aesthetic level? Well, he has given us some clues. In a very old interview, he stated that, "It's my contention that feudalism is a natural condition of human beings. Not that it's the only condition, and not that it's the right condition, it's just the way we have of falling into organizations." In the Dune novel itself, Herbert gives us a fictional quote he attributes to the Princess Irulan. The concept of progress acts as a protective mechanism to shield us from the terrors of the future. This last quote in particular is almost spookily similar to some of Gray's assertions about the illusory nature of human progress. It also chimes with one of the most primary liberal thinkers of the modern period, English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who in his Leviathan, published in 1651, identified the state of nature one of lawlessness and chaos. Without any government organising this individual hunt, mankind is to compete for things it needs for survival, such as food and shelter. And while good and evil are relative to Hobbes, the greatest evil is one for everyone: the fear of violent death. For all its ills, for Hobbes and Gray at least, feudalism is almost always an improvement on this state of nature, a life solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. According to Gray, although technology is progressive in the sense that it's cumulative and all but irreversible, human social advances are not. In fact, they are relatively precarious things, and given the right or wrong conditions, humans can quickly revert to feudalism or even barbarism. According to him, postmodern thinkers may question scientific progress, but it is undoubtedly real. The illusion is the belief that it can affect any fundamental alteration to the human condition. History is not an ascending spiral of human advance, or even an inch-by-inch crawl to a better world. It is an unending cycle in which changing knowledge interacts with unchanging human need. Dune paints a picture of a world largely consistent with this, a world where technology has continued to advance for many thousands of years, while society has remained or perpetually reverts to an essentially feudal one, and age-old human drives and frailties are always with us. Today's techno-feudalism, as John Gray puts it, is not a stable regime. Tightening ecological limits on growth, job-destroying technologies like AI, and the absence of any credible legitimating myth make a combustible admixture. That doesn't mean the system will collapse. The contradictions of our society show no sign of giving birth to any new order. As Denis Villeneuve intimates, ceaseless struggle is the reality. The glory of his film is that, even as it offers no way out, it transfigures unending conflict into a thing of beauty. Both Dune and the Star Wars prequels have clear analogues with our current geopolitical climate, but Star Wars' scope is rather more limited and less penetrating, I would argue. Folks looking for genuine depth, complexity, and maybe even some insight into the world we find ourselves in today are better served by Dune. All this despite the fact that it was published back in 1965. The real strength of Star Wars was its visuals, its action, its whimsical high adventure. It was Errol Flynn, John Wayne, exotic far-off lands, Camelot, Robin Hood, Treasure Island, westerns, war comics, Flash Gordon, grand adventures tantalizingly just beyond our grasp. This was the intention as stated by Lucas back in 1977, and in this aspect the original trilogy was, and still is, absolutely brilliant. In trying to reframe the existing Star Wars movies as something more grand, more high-minded, saturated with the dreaded lore. Something more Dune-like. Even if George Lucas had indeed had this kind of thing in mind when he made the original films, he really left the whole thing propped up precariously on its much weaker leg. I might even go as far as to say he threw the baby out with the bathwater. The strongest and most distinctive elements of the original Star Wars trilogy were greatly diminished or thrown out altogether, and what remained was little more than a largely unconvincing facsimile of the basic Dune arc. Unlike the OT, unfortunately, I don't really see anything significant in the prequels that isn't done far better in Frank Herbert's original novel, and now in Denis Villeneuve's Dune movies. But please, don't get me wrong, this is not a let's slag off the prequels and George Lucas video by any means. As I said, I've never hated the movies. That would be very silly indeed. They didn't ruin my childhood, destroy Star Wars, put my cat in the microwave, or anything of that nature, nor did the sequels for that matter. I just don't think they're very good at all. And yeah, I don't like how they've clouded my enjoyment of the original Star Wars trilogy, to a degree at least. Rather, this video is a thank you to Denis Villeneuve and the army of men and women who worked on Dune and its sequel. You have made a pair of amazing sci-fi fantasy movies, better than any movie in this genre made in the past 30 years or so for my money, and in fact, you kind of made the movies I wanted and needed all those years ago. I never saw these films coming, and I never knew that I needed them. Thank you, and here's to a third movie.